Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on History Podcast. Tonight I'm joined by Dr. Dale McClellan, and tonight's live stream is going to be based on his upcoming book titled The Bible Says So: What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues. And I have the affiliate link to purchase the book in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment after the stream is over. With that being said, thank you for joining me tonight, Dan.
Thank you for having me, and I apologize to everybody who was hoping this was going to start 15 minutes ago. That's entirely my fault. So
it's all right, Dan. It happens. All right. So how did we get the Bible?
Oh gosh, that's a long story, but it is chapter 1 of my book. I figured it might be good to have a 30,000-foot view of how we got the Bible. So I talk about how the earliest parts of the Bible are probably fragments of poetry that were worked into later poetry, just because poetry was the way that short letters in poetry were the way that writing began with Hebrew. And it wasn't until around the late 9th, early 8th century BCE that we start to see narrative prose, so historical narrative in alphabetic scripts like Hebrew. And so we don't get the real possibility of historical narrative until around that time period. So everything that's historical narrative is at the very earliest, late 9th century, but more likely 8th, 7th century BCE. So Kings, Samuel, things like that come at the very earliest around that time period. And then I get into the Pentateuch, starting with things like Deuteronomy, probably under the reign of Josiah. That's where we get the earliest layer of that. And then we have the priestly layers. We have some pre-P and some post-P stuff going on. And so by the time we get into the post-exilic period, that's when we're picking up steam and we start to see a Pentateuch kind of forming. And then we get a bunch of post-exilic literature, a lot of the wisdom literature, a lot of the writings, the Psalms, Proverbs, Job, things like that come in the Persian period. And then into the Hellenistic period, we get some other texts, particularly apocalyptic texts. We get Daniel. Probably the last text that was written that appears in the Hebrew Bible is the book of Daniel. But and then we get into the New Testament, and we get the Pauline letters, we get the Gospels, starting probably around 70 CE, and then extending probably to Luke, I would say first quarter of the 2nd century CE. And then we got a bunch of pseudepigraphical texts like the epistles of John, the epistles of Peter, and James, and then the pastoral epistles, and so on. And so it's about 1,100 years of all different kinds of genres that are coming together to serve the rhetorical goals of a bunch of different kinds of authors, some associated with prophets, some associated with the state, some associated with literary circles. And it's a big mess, in other words. And and it comes together to give us what we know today as the Bible.
Can the Bible talk about the Bible? And my second part to that question is, does it saying it is inspired mean it is inspired?
I don't think the Bible can talk about the Bible, because the Bible didn't exist during the lifetime of anyone who wrote anything that ended up in the Bible. The author of the latest text, whether it's one of the pastoral epistles or 2 Peter or something like that, was surely dead and gone by probably the 4th quarter of the 2nd century CE. And while we have scripture in this time period, it hasn't been brought together into even a canon, much less a single volume of scripture that is known as the Bible. That doesn't really happen until the beginning of the 5th century CE. So any reference to scripture in the Bible is going to come, anything in the New Testament is going to be referring to Jewish scripture, unless it's coming around the 2nd century CE, where it might be referring to the Gospels, or we have this one reference in 2 Peter to the letters of Paul and the other scriptures. So at the very tail end of the New Testament, you begin to have New Testament texts referred to as scripture, but that's kind of an amorphous, open-ended category. We don't get that category delineated until 3rd into the 4th century CE, and then it's not until the 5th that everything gets gathered together into one volume that then becomes referred to as the Bible. So no, I don't think it can refer to itself, and I don't think that 2 Timothy 3:16 is referring to even the scriptures, certainly not the Bible, as inspired. It uses the word theopneustos, which means God breathed. And this is not the usual word for inspired. Entheos is the usual Greek word for inspired in this time period. Theopneustos, until we get to Origen in the 3rd century CE, is used to mean life-giving. It's God-breathed in the sense that God breathed the breath of life into Adam, and he became a living soul. And so it is used in reference to the nation of Israel. It's used in reference to sandals. It's used in reference to rivers of water. It's used in reference to ointments that are used to preserve the lifelike appearance of a corpse for 3 days. That's the time period during which the spirit might return to the body. And so you wanted the body to be in good working order. So there's a great book by a gentleman named John C. Poirier called The Invention of the Inspired Text, which goes through and demonstrates that this word is used a bunch in the 1st and 2nd century CE, and it's always used to mean life-giving. And then Origen used it, quoted 2 Timothy 3:16 dozens of times, and made the case that this means inspired, and all the scriptures are inspired. And so that's when there's this pivot in what this word means, and ever since it has been understood to mean inspired. But the author who wrote it, who was not Paul, by the way, somebody writing well after Paul's death, wanted to say that the Jewish scriptures were life-giving. And ever since then, it has been misunderstood to mean that the Bible is inspired.
Does the Bible say that God made everything out of nothing?
I don't think so. What we have at the very beginning, Genesis 1:1, is a temporal clause according to the consensus of scholars today. It doesn't say in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It says in the beginning of God creating the heavens and the earth was welter and waste, and the Spirit of God hovered on the face of the deep. And so it's a temporal clause explaining the state of affairs at that point in time when God began to create. And there's already stuff there. There's the depths. The earth is submerged in murkiness below the depths, and there's darkness all around. And so we already have existing material. And we don't see a change in that until we get to the late 2nd century CE. And in 2 Maccabees 7:28, in Romans and Colossians and Hebrews and elsewhere, it seems to talk about things being created from things that are not, or from the non-being, or something like this. And this has traditionally been understood to refer to creation out of nothing, creation ex nihilo, but it's actually conventional Greek wisdom about matter existing either in a state of being or in a state of non-being. If it has form and function, then it is existing in a state of being. But if it lacks form and function, it is a part of this material substrate, or the substratum. And creation is a process of giving form and function to that material substrate. And then in the 2nd century CE, we have apologists who are arguing with Gnostics and other Greek thinkers about the rationality of the resurrection and about the morality of the notion of eternal matter, because Greek folks thought that deity and matter were both eternal and existed as long as the other. And for Christians, this raised a moral problem. And you get around 170 CE, the first articulation of this notion that, no, we're just going to say God created everything out of nothing. And this violated the conventional wisdom, out of nothing, nothing comes. And they said, no, we're going to say everything was created out of nothing. And so that's thoroughly post-biblical, the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, which is also the consensus view of scholars who study early Christianity.
Does the Bible say that God lies?
I think the Bible does say... Excuse me, I still have remnants of a cold or flu or something. The Bible suggests that God lies and is willing to use deception in a number of places, even though there are places like Numbers and elsewhere where it says God is not a man that he should lie, or a human or a mortal that he should change his mind. But we also have places where it quite literally and explicitly said God changed his mind. So, for instance, in Jonah, and a number of other places. But we do have places where God is represented as explicitly lying. And I think the best example is the story of Micaiah in 1 Kings 22, where King Ahab is wondering if he's going to go up to Ramoth Gilead to engage the Philistines in battle. And he brings out his court prophets who go hut, 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 out in front of him. And he says, shall I go up? And they said, the Lord says you should go up. He will deliver the people into your hands. And then for whatever reason, Ahab's like, I need a second opinion. Bring me Micaiah, even though he never prophesies what's good for me. And Micaiah comes out and kind of flippantly goes, yeah, go ahead. And he says, you're lying to me. That's not what God said. And then Micaiah says, I saw the Lord seated upon a throne, surrounded by the hosts of heaven. And God asked for a volunteer, saying, who will go and entice Ahab to go up to battle so that he may fall? And it said, the Hebrew text says the Spirit, ha-ruach. Some people say it's just a spirit, but it quite explicitly is the Spirit came forth and said, I will go forth and be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets so that he will go up and fall. And it says, God says, you will do that and you will be successful. Go and do, and deputizes the Spirit. And then Ahab ends up going up and to battle so that he can be killed. So God intentionally used the very Spirit of God to intentionally deceive Ahab to his very death. I think that's probably the most explicit example of God lying in the Bible. But you also have Jeremiah, who repeatedly kind of says, good one, God, you pulled one over on us. You sent those prophets to deceive everybody. And this kind of thing occurs in a number of places. And you even have in the story of Jacob, the patriarchs seem to be kind of play fast and loose with reality in a bunch of places. You know, the whole, oh, that's not my wife, it's my sister game that they play a bunch of times in the Pentateuch. And then Jacob is exploiting Laban so that he can get all the big fat sheep. And these are all kind of things that are manipulated by God. And so I have a friend named John Anderson who wrote a book called the I'm forgetting the title of the book, but he wrote a book about the theology of deception. The Divine Trickster, Jacob and the Divine Trickster was the name of the book, and it's about a theology of divine deception, how God is willing to use deception and to inspire the patriarchs to deceive others in order to bring about the promise to Abraham, in order to ensure that the patriarchs are able to, reproduce and be successful and spread their progeny all over. So I think there are a bunch of different ways that the Bible represents God deceiving and just straight up lying and knowingly and openly doing so, even as other parts of the Bible say, no, God would never do that.
Does the Bible say that God has a body?
I think the Bible absolutely says God has a body in a number of places. We have numerous references to different body parts of God. We have references to God walking through the Garden of Eden and making noise. We have reference to God using their hand to cover up Moses' face as they pass on by so that Moses just sees God's backside and won't see God's face, because God says, no human can see me and live. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, and even much of the New Testament, anthropomorphism is the default, the presumed normative position of everything, that God is human-shaped and can be human-sized. You also have God appearing to a bunch of people. There are narratives that seem to conflate the identity of God with the Malach Adonai, the angel of the Lord, when Hagar, for instance, is talking to the Malach, and she finishes up naming Adonai, the one I have spoken with. You have in Exodus 3, Moses speaks to either Adonai or the angel of Adonai. Genesis 22, Judges 6 with Gideon, Judges 13 with Manoach and his wife, and other places where God physically and interacts with humanity, but then an editor has come through and written the word Malach in a few places, messenger, to create this kind of convoluted narrative where we don't know if it's the messenger or God themselves. And so I think you see anthropomorphism, a corporeal notion of God throughout the Hebrew Bible. And then as Greek philosophy starts to influence their thinking about God, it becomes unseemly to have a corporeal anthropomorphic deity. And so you begin to see God's visibility and accessibility kind of get further and further away. You can pray to God, you can directly access God, And particularly if you have the Logos, which is the mediator between the divine and the material world. But God gets further and further away and more immaterial. And you have later on folks like Origen talking about how, oh, yeah, the Jewish folks and even a bunch of Christians think God has a body and of flesh and bone. And we know that's not true because the philosophers say so. And so there was obviously a debate that took place within early Christianity, but because the ones who kind of spread Christianity the furthest and the widest were the apologists, were the folks who were trying to make the gospel more palatable for the Greco-Roman intelligentsia. The concept of a more philosophically palatable deity was the most widespread, and so that quickly took over. And then you had the incorporeal, the immaterial, the invisible God that became the dogma that would rule the rest of Christianity.
Who is Asherah, and is she God's wife and mentioned in the Bible?
So Asherah is mentioned in the Bible. There are a couple of references to Asherah as the goddess, and the majority of the references, however, seem to be to a cultic object that is described as being planted, as being pulled up, as being cut down, as being burnt. So it probably was some kind of stylized sacred tree or something like that. But we don't have any negative references to Asherah until texts that are usually dated to around the time of Josiah and later. But we have a lot of references to Asherah in other Northwest Semitic literature, particularly the Ugaritic literature, where Asherah is the consort, the partner, the wife of the high deity, El, in the Ugaritic pantheon. And that seems to be what's going on in the Hebrew Bible, although El and Adonai are conflated. We have the conflation of the patriarchal high deity and then the youthful warrior storm deity, and the two of them become one, as the great poets, the Spice Girls, once sang. That's a song about a different kind of two becoming one. But and then we have Adonai takes over Asherah as their consort, their partner or wife. And we've discovered in the 60s and 70s, we discovered inscriptions, places like Kuntilat Ajrud, Khirbet el Kom. We discovered inscriptions and even drawings that refer to Adonai of Shomron, which is Samaria, or Adonai of Teman, and his Asherah. And while some scholars would suggest this is a reference to the cultic object, at Kuntilat Ajrud, this inscription talks about blessings to Adonai of Shomron and to his Asherah, is written over the top of drawings of two anthropomorphic figures, a clearly male figure and then a clearly female figure. And so scholars are coming around to identifying these figures as Adonai and Asherah. So we know that in the pre-exilic period, there were obviously Israelites who were perfectly happy with understanding Asherah as the consort, the partner, the wife of the God of Israel. And it's not until Josiah and his campaign of cult centralization, he was basically saying, I'm taking my ball and going home. You're not allowed to worship anywhere except for the Jerusalem temple. You're not allowed to worship any other deities apart from Adonai. You're not allowed to worship using any other priesthood except for my priesthood. And this is the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic literature. But this is probably the time period that ancestral worship, the worship of Asherah, perhaps even the worship of Baal and other deities became outlawed and became vilified. And so from then on, you don't have any of this worship of Asherah, except for maybe some Judean pillar figurines, these female figurines that some scholars think may have had some connection to Asherah. They probably didn't, but after the vilification and the demonization of Asherah, these figurines probably filled a gap in that private domestic worship where Asherah would have been important for women who are pregnant, women who are delivering, women who are breastfeeding, women who are raising children. That might have helped fill that gap in the now criminalized worship of the mother goddess. So we do have references to that in the Bible. we do have also, however, a lot of vilification of Asherah in the Bible as well, including her worship, which even according to the Bible was going on in the Jerusalem temple.
Does God have a father? Did he inherit Israel from another God?
That's one of my favorite passages of Scripture. That's Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, part of the Song of Moses, which covers virtually all of Deuteronomy 32. But we have this interesting passage there where in like the King James Version and a lot of more traditional translations, it says that the Most High divided up the nations, the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. And in the ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, it says according to the number of the angels of God. And a lot of scholars were like, hey, the Septuagint translators really liked to render angels of God when their source text in Hebrew said B'nai Elohim, sons of God. So I bet the Hebrew there originally said B'nai Elohim, sons of God. And then we found 4Q Deuteronomy J, one of the fragments from Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls, that demonstrated that that was one of the readings that was in circulation. So all but demonstrating the accuracy of that theory. And so what it says there is that the Most High, Elyon, divided up the nations according to the number of the B'nai Elohim, the children of God. And then verse 9 says, and the Lord's portion was his people. Jacob was his share of the inheritance. And so scholars kind of scratch their head a little bit like, you don't inherit something from yourself. You inherit something from someone else. And we have a bunch of references throughout the Hebrew Bible to the land of Israel as Adonai's inheritance. And so one position that is quite prominent, I don't know if it's the consensus view, but I think there's probably parity among the scholars who say, no, this isn't the case, and the scholars that say, yes, this is the case. But the idea is that this seems to distinguish Elyon from Adonai. It seems to suggest that Elyon's reception of Israel as their inheritance was a gift from the high deity who divided up the nations. Because if Elyon is also Adonai, then it would have had to have been dividing up the nations according to the number of the children of God plus one, namely Adonai, or namely Elyon, because Elyon is not one of the children of God. 70 nations on earth, 70 children of God, according to the Ugaritic tradition. So a lot of scholars point out that this might preserve a very early tradition where Adonai is given Israel by a separate deity, Elyon, the Most High. And in the Ugaritic literature, the patriarchal high deity is a distinct deity from the storm deity. And Adonai, the God of Israel, is repeatedly represented as a storm deity in the mode of Baal, one of the B'nai Elohim in the Ugaritic literature. And so it would fit quite well with the pantheon as it's found in the Ugaritic literature. And so scholars suggest that Adonai, who seems to be a transplant into Israel, was not a part of the original pantheon. It's not Isra Adonai, it's Israel. And then we don't have Adonai showing up until the 9th century. But Adonai seems to be a latecomer to the pantheon and seems to have found a way into the pantheon on the second tier by taking over this divine profile of the storm deity. And so there are even scholars who are arguing that prior to adopting the storm deity profile, Adonai may have had another divine profile, may have been a god of like metallurgy and snakes and volcanoes and things like that. But that theory hasn't really taken hold within the scholarly community. But for decades now, scholars have been suggesting that Adonai seems to have been given the nation of Israel as their inheritance from a higher deity who would have been, according to Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, the father of the God of Israel.
Did God say to sacrifice your firstborn child?
I think we do have a commandment in Exodus 22, 28, and 29 for Israelites to sacrifice their firstborn. It just says, your firstborn you will give to me, and you will do the same for your oxen and your sheep. 7 days they will be with their mother, and then on the 8th day you will give him to me. And since whatever is being done with the oxen and the sheep is the same as what's going to be done with the firstborn, it certainly seems like the commandment there is to offer them up as a sacrifice. And I think there are a lot of scholars who disagree with this. I wouldn't say they're in the majority. Again, I think they're maybe split 50-50. But I think the scholars who argue this is about child sacrifice have a much better case to make, because we do have other parts of Exodus 13, Exodus 34, where the commandment is, you've got to sacrifice your firstborn. Just kidding. You're actually going to redeem them so that they don't get sacrificed, which seems like an odd law to have, kind of a pretend sacrifice your firstborn, psych, we don't really want you to sacrifice your firstborn. It sounds like these are laws that are trying to renegotiate what's going on with some earlier law. And the same is true, I think, of stories like the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac, where Abraham is commanded to sacrifice Isaac, but then there is a ram is offered as a substitute. And so just like in some of the other renegotiated versions of this command, there's another animal that's offered as a substitute that redeems the child. I think we have a number of instances where, well, not a number, we have a couple of instances where later prophets are trying to grapple with this and trying to make sense of it. For instance, Jeremiah takes the Shaggy approach and says, it wasn't me. Says, I commanded no such thing. I never would have thought about commanding any such thing. But then in Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 25 and 26, Ezekiel has Adonai saying, I gave them commandments that were not good, in order to desolate them and causing them to pass their firstborn over the fire. And in this way, I showed them, so that they might know that I am Adonai. Basically, I showed them who's boss. And a lot of scholars suggest that this is Ezekiel recognizing that there is a command in the Jewish scriptures to sacrifice your firstborn child. So I think there are a bunch of things that point to everybody being kind of uneasy with the fact that there seems to be a law requiring sacrifice of the firstborn.
Does the Bible say that the rape victim must marry the rapist?
I think you have indirectly, but also not really. So in Deuteronomy 22, we have some laws about, for instance, earlier in the chapter, you have this law about what happens if a man marries a woman and then for whatever reason he's convinced that she's not a virgin, and she has to, the parents have to bring out the evidence of her virginity and so on. And then we get into these laws about what happens if a man and a woman are caught committing adultery. They both must be killed to purge this evil from the land. And then we have a couple of laws about what happens if a man, the first case is in the case of a woman who has been betrothed. So she's engaged, she's not yet married, and there are two circumstances that are addressed. If a man finds her in the city and lies with her, the text basically says she didn't cry out, and so that's adultery. They both have to die. But if he finds her in the country, there's nobody around, and she will have cried out, and nobody was there to save her, so only he is put to death, and she is not put to death. And then the next law says, but a woman who's not betrothed, then and it says if he takes her and lies with her, then he must pay the father a bride price, like it's like 100 shekels or something like that. It's multiple times what the normal bride price would be, because he has, and the verbal root is anah, which has violated her, and he can't divorce her for the rest of his life. And so there are some folks who will argue, and so in short, it's the perpetrator who's required to marry the victim, and this would seem to mean that the victim doesn't have any say in the matter, but has to marry the perpetrator. But we have something similar in Exodus 22:16, where it talks about seduction. And it says that the perpetrator has to pay so much to the father, and then the father actually has the ability to either accept or reject the marriage of the daughter to the perpetrator. He keeps the money irrespective, but he can refuse to allow the perpetrator to marry his daughter. And so probably if these laws were ever actually enforced, then they probably would have recognized the authority of the father to step in and say, no, My daughter's not going to marry her rapist. So the law is written so as to require that the perpetrator marry and provide for the victim. But in reality, we don't know if this ever happened, but the father probably would have just stepped in and said, no, I'll just take the money and I'll hold on to my daughter. So it's a little of both, but these laws are propaganda anyway. They probably weren't ever enforced or even widely known until around the middle of the 2nd century BCE anyway. So I don't think there was ever a case where a rape victim was forced to marry her rapist.
Does the Bible say that women need to cover up?
So there's only one part of the entire Bible that says anything about women needing to cover up any part of their body. And that's in 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul says that if a woman is prophesying or praying in church, that she needs to have a head cover on. And this is not about lust or anything like that. This is just about some kind of social convention associated with worship and with women and probably their hair. But we have a lot of people who misunderstand passages in Proverbs or passages in the pastoral epistles that talk about women needing to dress modestly as references to women covering up parts of their body that might drive men to lust. And that's not remotely what the texts are saying. Whenever they talk about modesty in the Bible, it's always modesty in the sense of not dressing ostentatiously or not dressing to try to project one's status or wealth, because they give examples in a bunch of these places, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, about immodest dress. And it's always gold and silver, braided hair, expensive clothing, lots of makeup. Never once does it say anything about plunging necklines or bare midriffs or skirts that are too high or anything like that. The Bible never once says that women have to cover up parts of their bodies so that men are not driven to lust. The closest we get to that is Jesus telling men that if they lust after a woman, they need to poke their eye out, which obviously indicates who is at fault in that particular transgression.
Does the Bible say that abortion is murder?
The Bible does not say that abortion is murder. It never directly addresses abortion, but I think the question comes down to when the Bible acknowledges the beginning of personhood. A lot of people today try to make it a question of human life, but in reality, throughout history, for literally thousands of years, it's not been a question of human life, it's been a question of human personhood. Because you can have life without personhood. And so in the Bible, the only indications we have of where they drew the line between a legal and moral person and a life that was not a legal and moral person is in Exodus 21, verses 22 and 23, and then it extends to verse 25. But here we have a passage that addresses and is borrowing from the laws of Hammurabi what to do if men who are fighting accidentally injure a pregnant woman. And the two outcomes that are addressed are, first, the injury causes the pregnant woman to miscarry. And in that case, the penalty is a fine that is assessed by the husband and that is arbitrated by the courts. The other outcome is if the injury causes the death of the woman or some other kind of permanent injury, in which case talionic justice is activated. And that refers to the idea of life for life, tooth for tooth, eye for eye, burn for burn, things like that. In other words, whatever happens to the victim is done to the perpetrator. And that's really the gold standard for the concept of a full moral and legal person. If talionic justice is activated, you've got a full legal and moral person. But if it causes a miscarriage, all it is a fine. And so this indicates that a fetus was considered more property than person. And this is not a dichotomy, this is a spectrum. And you can have people falling on all different parts of the spectrum. In fact, enslaved people were also a little more property than person, but not nearly as much so as a fetus, because they had a socially standardized value assigned to them. We also have in Exodus 21 the law of the goring ox, where if somebody is warned that their ox is goring people and it gets out and it kills somebody, supposed to be the death penalty. Or there's also an option where the family of the victim can say, no, we'll just take all their money. But if it gores an enslaved person, they owe 30 shekels. So that's just the socially standardized value of an enslaved person, 30 shekels. But when it comes to a fetus, they just say, well, husband, what do you think? What does this guy owe you? And then they've got judges there who can make sure it's not too exorbitant. So on that spectrum, men are at one end, a adult male citizen is at one end, and then you've probably got women and foreigners, you've got the enslaved folks, and then closer to the property side, you've got the fetus. And there are other indications that this changes once you get the influx of Greek philosophy, because once you get to the Greek translation of this passage, the Septuagint, it actually reinterprets it so that the two outcomes are not miscarriage and the death of the mother. The two outcomes are the death of the fetus in both instances, but in the first instance, it's the death of the fetus when, and the Greek says, when there is no body. In other words, the fetus is not fully formed yet. And then the second outcome is when there is a body. In other words, the fetus has fully formed. And so the fine is if it has not fully formed, and the death penalty is if it has fully formed. And so here, what we probably have is the influence of an Aristotelian notion of ensoulment, where the soul enters the body around the time that the fetus becomes fully formed. And this was likely associated with the quickening, where when the mother can feel the fetus independently moving in the womb, that's the quickening. And for Greek philosophers, the fetus was fully formed about 40 days of gestation for men and about 90 days for women, because they thought of women as just underdeveloped men. But this is the idea that what we're concerned with is for the presence of a soul. And this doesn't happen for the author or the translators of the Septuagint until around the quickening. When we get into early Christianity, there are debates raging because we have three different main philosophical ideas here. The Epicureans and the Pythagoreans thought that the soul entered the body at conception. The Aristotelians said happens at the quickening or the full development of the fetus. And then the Stoics said it happened when the baby was born and made contact with the outside air. And so you have early Christians who seem to side with the Epicureans and the Pythagoreans for the notion of ensoulment at conception. But then Augustine in late 4th, early 5th century CE says, no, it's at the quickening. And so he explicitly says, it's unseemly, we don't like it, but it's not murder until the quickening. And that is really the dominant position of Christianity, with some ebbing and flowing and arguing and things like that, all the way down to the 19th century. The 1800s is when a critical mass of Christians came around and said, no, we like it at conception. And so it changes. And so even within early Christianity, it's not murder unless the gestation has progressed to the full development of the fetus or the quickening. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's never murder. And even within early Jewish literature, you have discussion about how a fetus is just water for the first 40 days, and then it's just a part of the mother's thigh. And then it does not become a nephesh, it does not become a living soul, according to the early rabbis, until either the head has left the birth canal, or if the baby is born in breech, the majority of the body has left the birth canal. And so that they say prior to this time period, it's not yet a soul, so it's okay. If the mother's life is in danger, then the baby can be aborted. But once half of the body is out or the head is out, you can no longer abort the baby, because now it is a person, it is a soul. So you have a bunch of different positions, and the Bible has multiple different positions, and none of them are really the blanket notion that abortion is always murder.
Does the Bible condone slavery?
100%, from beginning to end. There's not a single syllable of the Bible that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever questions, much less condemns, the practice itself of buying, selling, and owning other human beings. In Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46, we have an explicit, and not just condoning, but endorsement of chattel slavery, as long as the enslaved folks are foreigners. You can buy, sell, and pass them on as inheritance if you're buying them from foreigners who reside among you or from people in other nations. You can enslave them forever. They are your property. And this is a contrast with the way you're supposed to treat Israelites who become debt slaves. It says not to treat them harshly, but to treat them more like a wage earner or a day laborer or something like that. And then it says, now foreigners, you can go to town on them, but your native Israelites, your brethren, you are not to treat harshly. So we have an explicit, unambiguous, very clear endorsement of chattel slavery in Leviticus 25. And there's nothing anywhere that says we don't like this practice. There are several places where they say we don't like it when it happens to us, but those same folks are also basically give the thumbs up about enslaving other folks. The out group is they're happy to enslave the out group. So yeah, from beginning to end, the Bible condones slavery.
Does the Hebrew Bible suggest that the Messiah would be born of a virgin? And was the New Testament wrong to link Jesus to Isaiah?
We don't have a prophecy in the Hebrew Bible about the Messiah being born of a virgin. We do have a prophecy in Isaiah that there was a woman who was pregnant who would shortly give birth to a son, and the king was supposed to, or actually, no, I think in the Hebrew it says she will call him Emmanuel, meaning God with us. But this was a prophecy about something that would happen within a few months. So it was something that was limited to the 8th century BCE, because it says before the child knows the difference between good and evil, the northern kingdom and Damascus would fall. So this is a reference to the destruction of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE. So the prophecy that we have in Isaiah 7:14 is fulfilled in 722 BCE. It has nothing to do with any future Messiah. However, when that gets translated into Greek in probably the 3rd or maybe 2nd century BCE before the Septuagint, the translation choices opened the door for some different interpretive options. So it actually changes it from a woman is pregnant to a woman will become pregnant. And then it changes she will call his name to you will call his name. And so this sounds more like a prophecy. But once we get into Matthew, then the quotation of the passage is even more different. It is something that will happen in the future. The Alma, the young woman, is translated into Greek as Parthenos, which can mean, doesn't have to mean, but can mean virgin. And then Matthew says they will call his name Emmanuel. And people will say, well, his name was Jesus, not Emmanuel. So what's going on there? And I think that's why that's where Matthew doesn't say you, the father, or you, the mother, will call him Emmanuel. They will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And I think that's Matthew saying Jesus's following will recognize that he manifests God's presence, and so they will refer to him as the one who reifies God with us. So what Matthew does is not what was intended by the author. However, all engagements with the Bible as prophetic or authoritative or inspired literature have to negotiate with it, have to make it meaningful or useful or important to the readership in its own day. And so there's always going to be a negotiating with it. So wrong, it's wrong in the sense that it's not what the author of Isaiah intended, but if you accept that kind of negotiating with the Bible, which all people who think of it as an inspired or an authoritative text must to one degree or another, then it's just a manifestation of that negotiation that must take place, in which case I would say it's probably not wrong. But I usually prioritize a historical critical approach. And so from that perspective, yeah, it's not what the author intended.
Is Satan God's enemy, and is Satan and Lucifer referring to the same person?
So Lucifer, no, absolutely is not referred to as Satan anywhere in the Bible. That is also from Isaiah, where we have this sarcastic reference to the king of Babylon. Pretty explicitly, the text is referring to the king of Babylon and sarcastically saying, "Oh, he raised his throne above the stars of heaven, and then look how he fell." But Lucifer here is the Latin translation of the Greek Heosphoros, which is a translation of the Hebrew Halel ben Shachar, which means shining one, son of the dawn. And this title is a reference to the planet Venus, which was associated with deities in the Northwest Semitic pantheon, in the Greek pantheon, in the Roman pantheon. So everybody kind of knew what was going on here. And so Lucifer is just a sarcastic reference to the king of Babylon. And Jerome even used the word Lucifer to translate Hosphorus in a passage in 2 Peter, I forget, 2:19 or something like that, where it talks about the day star rising in your heart, which scholars agree is probably seems to be a reference to Jesus doing something, but the term in the Vulgate is Lucifer there as well. So Jerome didn't think Lucifer was this evil character. This was just a pretty neutral term, and it wouldn't become a reference to Satan until much later. But in the Hebrew Bible, Satan is not an individual character. Satan is just a generic reference to an adversary, an accuser, an opponent. And so anybody could fill the role. Anybody who was being adversarial or accusing or acting as an opponent to somebody could be called a Satan. And so the angel of the Lord in Numbers 22 stands as a Satan against Balaam. So we have that kind of use of Satan throughout the Hebrew Bible, and it's usually, or it does not have the direct, the definite article ha. It's not ha-Satan, it's just Satan. And then in Job and in Zechariah, we have a reference to ha-Satan. And this is not using Satan as a name, it's using it, it seems to be using it as a role within the divine council. This was somebody whose job it was to accuse humans, either in order to test them or in order to act as kind of a prosecuting attorney or something like that. But this is somebody who's on God's payroll. This is an employee of God. And that's why we have this little kind of soap opera at the beginning of Job, where the Satan presents himself before God with all the other B'nai Elohim, the children of God, and says, I bet I can get that guy Job, and basically makes a bet with God. In the style of trading places. I don't know if it was for just a buck, but we don't have Satan as the name of an individual enemy of God until the New Testament. And in between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, we have the Enochic literature, which retells the story from Genesis 6 about the B'nai Elohim and the daughters of humanity as a story of rebellious angels who go down and teach wickedness to humanity. And this is how they solve the problem of evil. Oh, it was a bunch of angels who went down and taught evil to humanity, but they're led by a head malevolent angel. And in the book of Enoch, they have a bunch of different names: Melchirashah, Shemi-Hazah, Asael, Azazel. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's the angel of darkness. You have a bunch of different names. And then Satan is kind of a generic category of deity. You have plural Satans in the book of Enoch, but you also have Azazel referred to as the Satan at one point. And so by the New Testament, Satan has become the name of this head malevolent angel. And so Satan is the head bad angel by the time we get to the New Testament. And so there's no Satan anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. And then because of the influence of First Enoch, by the New Testament, Satan is the main bad guy that is causing all the problems for humanity on earth.
Does the Bible say that Jesus is God?
I think we probably have a couple of passages in Titus and in 2 Peter where we have a reference to our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. And I think these are two of the last books written in the New Testament. These are the ones that are coming like 125, 150 CE. And so I think there's a sense in which Jesus somehow is identified with God, but they never explain precisely how. And certainly it was not a Trinitarian sense, because the Trinitarian formula, that whole conceptual framework, would not exist until a century later at the very earliest. But when we look elsewhere in the Gospels and in Paul and things like that, we do not see Jesus being treated as God. We see Jesus as someone who is distinct from God, but who does what only God is supposed to be able to do, and in some sense manifests God's presence. And so I think you see this in, for instance, the story of Jesus forgiving sins in Mark 2, and I think the story is also told in Luke, where they say, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And Jesus doesn't wink at them and say, "What do you think that makes me?" Jesus says, "No. What's easier, to say to this paralyzed man, take up your bed and walk, or to say your sins are forgiven you? But so that you might know," because they obviously don't know, "that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he says to the paralyzed man, "Take up your bed and walk." And so Jesus is correcting their mistake, their misinformation about God being the only one who can forgive sins. So Jesus is doing what only God is supposed to be able to do, and we see that throughout the Gospels. And in John, it seems to be the most emphatic, but there the idea seems to be that Jesus is manifesting God's presence. So, for instance, in John 14, you have, is it Philip or Nathaniel? It's one of the disciples. Jesus is disappointed in him and says, do you not know, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father? And the idea isn't that Jesus is the Father, it's that Jesus is manifests the Father's presence. And so at the very end, John 20:28, you have Thomas's exclamation, referring to Jesus as my God and my Lord. And this is basically the fulfillment. Finally, somebody gets it. If you see me, you see the Father, not because I am the Father, but because I manifest the Father's presence. And I argue in the book that this made sense to people because this follows the precise logic of divine images, which all of them would have been familiar with, would have grown up with, and it would have been very intuitive to them that divine images are not the deity, but manifest the power, the authority, the presence of the deity, and can be referred to as if they were the deity. So I think you have Jesus functioning as a sentient divine image in at least the Gospel of John. I think this is going on as well within Paul. In fact, there's another scholar who just won an award for this research named Alexei Khadziadoniu, who published a paper talking about image Christology, the idea that when Paul says that Jesus is the image of God, the idea is a divine image of God. Or to be vulgar about it, to use a term doesn't really work for scholars, an idol. Jesus is a walking, talking, sentient idol, but Alexi and I both agree that divine images is a much more appropriate term. So, no, Jesus is not God until the very, very end of the New Testament. We don't know how Jesus is God at the very, very end of the New Testament, but we do know that it is not a Trinitarian sense, because that sense would take several centuries to develop.
What is the mark of the beast?
So we see that in Revelation 13, where there's this reference to a beast, and people will be forced to take this mark in their forehead or in their the palm of their right hand, and they would not be able to buy or sell unless they had the mark. And the idea is that this signifies belonging to the beast or fidelity to the beast. And scholars think there are a few different pieces of imagery that are involved in this idea of the mark and the number of the beast. Because the mark is on the forehead and the right hand, the only place in all the Bible where we have some kind of connection between something on the forehead and something on the hand is the command to keep the laws of God always before you, frontlets on your eyes and on the left hand. And this led to the practice of phylacteries, where you have a series of passages from the Torah written on a scroll that's kept in a box that would go on the forehead, and then there's a leather strap that goes around the left arm and goes down to the palm, and there's a box on the back as well. And so there's a sense in which the idea seems to be counterfeit worship practices. So the beast is going to require their followers counterfeit Jewish worship practices. There's the idea that a mark is written on the forehead to indicate enslavement to a master or belonging to a deity. For instance, in Ezekiel, there's a story where God sends a writer into Jerusalem, and they are told to put a mark on everybody who is disgusted by the unrighteousness in Jerusalem. And then God is going to send 8 executioners through the city, and they're going to kill anyone who does not have the mark. Old, young, man, woman, slave, free, show no mercy, kill anyone who doesn't have the mark. And so the idea of the mark of the beast seems to suggest this is someone who is faithful to the beast. And then the third piece of imagery probably has to do with money, because there's the idea of the image of the beast and the number of the beast, which is the name of the beast. And in the Roman world, money had an image of the emperor as well as the name of the emperor on it. And you would exchange it with your right hand, and you could not buy or sell unless you had money. And the number is 666 or 616. We have that in a very early manuscript as well. But both of these, using gematria, resolve to the name of Nero, Caesar Nero, depending on whether you're transliterating into Hebrew from Greek or Latin. If you're going from Greek, it's Neron Kaiser, and that adds up to 666. If you're going from Latin, it's Nero Kaiser, and that adds up to 616 once you transliterate it into Hebrew, and then add up the values of all the characters. And so this is probably a coded reference to Nero or to just Roman emperors in general who were notorious for tormenting and persecuting Christians. So this is really just a imagery that was intended to exhort Christians to greater faithfulness to the Christian community and to keep themselves unspotted from the Roman world. And the use of the mark of the beast is probably a way to kind of terrify them about the notion that the emperors would persecute them again, or as according to a tradition that was in circulation around that time, that Nero was going to come back from the dead, or come back from self-imposed exile and take over the Roman Empire and persecute Christians once again. So it's just imagery associated with the Roman Empire and what was going on at the end of the 1st century CE, and it's not a prophecy about anything that was going to take place in the future.
So I'm going to pull up the super chat before we close. Dr. Dan,
Okay.
What do you make of Mark 14:62 and Daniel 7:14? Is Jesus fulfilling the prophecy of the Son of Man? How can Jesus be divine but not God?
So the idea of being divine and not God just means that God does not exhaust the category of deity, that there is deity outside of God. And the notion that God exhausts the category of deity is a later philosophical innovation. Now, again, we have Jesus doing the things that God is supposed to do and manifesting God's presence. And part of that is adopting or arrogating the roles, the titles, and the imagery associated with God. And so the idea of the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, this is obviously associated with the idea of Adonai as the rider of the clouds, and ultimately with Baal as the rider of the clouds, as we see in the Ugaritic literature. But in Daniel 7, we have this reference to one like a son of man who comes in the clouds of heaven and comes to the Ancient of Days. And in Greek, that's Heos, comes until or unto the Ancient of Days. And there's an old Greek version of this. It was originally written in Aramaic, translated into Greek. There's an old Greek translation that changes Heos to just Hos, one letter difference. So now it says the one like a son of man comes in clouds of the heavens as the Ancient of Days, which is what Hos means, which would seem to be conflating their identities, suggesting that the Son of Man can manifest as the Ancient of Days. And I think this plays into Greco-Roman Jewish ideas of divine mediation, where the divine name was a vehicle of divine agency and power and authority and presence. And we see this in the way that Exodus 23, 20 and 21 tries to rationalize the fact that the angel of Adonai seems to be confused with God, because God tells the Israelites, I'm sending an angel before you to guide you on your way. Don't disobey him. Don't tick him off, because he doesn't have to forgive your transgressions, because my name is in him. And the idea is that the authorized possessor or bearer of the divine name exercises God's power and authority and can identify with God. And so to the degree that the Son of Man has the divine name, they are the authorized bearer of the divine name, they can refer to themselves as God, not because they are God, but because they're that divine image that has been enlivened and activated by the possession of the divine name. And we even see this in later rabbinic literature, where somebody, a certain heretic, it says, comes to Ravi Yedid and says, why does this passage say, come up to Adonai? Why doesn't God say, come up to me? And Ravi Yedid says, well, that's because it's not the God of Israel. It's actually Metatron, who has the same name as Adonai. And Metatron is the Adonai Katon, the little Adonai, because Metatron has been given the divine name. And so in virtue of that, can be referred to as if they were Adonai. And so Jesus is doing kind of the same stuff. So what we see is kind of an algebra problem. In the Hebrew Bible, God is X. But in the New Testament, Jesus says, hey, I'm X. And so we got to solve for X. And we have ways in the Hebrew Bible, in Greco-Roman period Judaism, that people are solving for X. That's the most likely answer to how first century Jewish people are solving for X when it comes to Jesus. We didn't come up with X equals 3 co-equal, co-eternal, consubstantial persons comprising the one essence, ousia, or being of God until the 4th century. And so that cannot be how we solve for X before that idea was even created. So my recommendation is that we look to the contemporary ideas that were already in circulation to solve that particular algebra problem. So Jesus can be divine and not be God, because you have a bunch of different deities and divinities and gods in the Hebrew Bible and even in the New Testament. And I think that explains why you have Jesus saying things that for an Old Testament reader, you would only expect the God of Israel to say.
Thank you for your super chat, Hakeem Rashid. And a reminder to everyone that I have the affiliate link in the description below to purchase Bible Says So, and it will also be in the pinned comment and just below the description of the video. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, Dan.
Thank you so much, Jacob. I appreciate your time. And also, folks, I just got in the mail the other day, and I've never done this before, but I got a bunch of what they what are called, I don't know what they're called actually, book plates or something like that. They're stickers. And so I was told, hey, sign a bunch of these, and then people who have a copy of the book, who want a signed copy, can be sent stickers with my signature on it. They can peel off the back and slap it in the book, and then you've got a signed copy of the book. So I've been getting a lot of questions about how to get signed copies. This is one of the ways that folks who would like a signed copy of my book are going to be able to get it. There are going to be other ways as well. There will be signed copies available. But folks who pre-order are going to be doing me the biggest favor, because that's going to help push the book up the New York Times bestseller list, which is going to make the publisher happier and happier with me, which will make it so I can write my next book, which I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to write it on. Somebody recently said I should do How We Got the Bible. So basically a book-length treatment of the first chapter of this book, where I go through and talk about who we think wrote all the books, how many different editors were involved, how the pieces all came together, when they were published, that kind of stuff. So I'm still thinking about that, but that's one of the ideas that's recently been floated.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.